Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zubko. In this interview, we explore how universities operate as informal diplomatic actors within the European Union's foreign policy landscape, moving beyond conventional soft power narratives. My guest today is Marina Cino Pagliarello. Hello.
Hello. Hi, Martin. Good morning, everyone.
Marina is a strategic advisor and consultant specializing in academic diplomacy, university positioning, and international partnership with extensive experience in European alliances and high-level institutional engagement. She is currently a Marie Skłodowska-Curie Research Fellow at the European University Institute in Florence and Senior Research Associate at LSE Consulting, where she is focusing on EU politics, public policy, and transnational higher education. This is my favorite topic because I've been around the university management for many years, and I'm very happy that Marina accepted the invitation and she is going to share some research insights and research experience with us. Let's start with the first question. How should we theoretically understand the role of universities when we speak about informal actors in the EU foreign policy, and why there is that informal? Why not actors?
Thank you, Martin. First of all, thank you so much for this invitation, and good morning, everyone. I think we can all agree that the urgency of this conversation is pretty clear. Russia full-scale invasion of Ukraine, is still testing Europe's democratic resolve. In the Middle East, the current conflict is, exposing this limit of formal diplomacy, where, traditional state channels simply cannot keep up. At the same time, we also know that academic freedom is under pressure, not only in fragile context, but, think about the US with universities, facing unprecedented political scrutiny, including, funding cuts. So overall, all of these tell us that the role of universities in diplomacy, is no longer theoretical. It's immediate and it's real. And I think, you were mentioning, and also the title of the episode is, soft power. I think we must move, beyond this vogue language of soft power, because when we talk about, soft power in universities, I think it suggests that universities are simply sort of passive transmitters of, influence or cultural branding. In reality, they can operate as, this autonomous infrastructure of diplomacy. And especially in my work, theoretically, I try to distinguish between science diplomacy, knowledge diplomacy, and informal diplomacy, because I think that each of them have a sort of different logic. Science diplomacy, is often state-led and instrumental, very often serving foreign policy goals. Knowledge diplomacy, on the other hand, sometimes, can reinforce global hierarchies or function as a branding, exercise. By contrast, informal diplomacy is, more decentralized, transnational, and non-state. And we can talk later about, my research, but it really works, through relational mechanisms, trust, adaptability, long-term cooperation. Trust is really here, a core mechanism, which is not really regulation. So I think that, this reframing of universities as informal diplomatic actors, allow them to move from passive tools of European external action, for example, to active diplomatic agents. And here, we can see that universities shape cooperation, mediate norms, and sustain a dialogue in various spaces where, formal diplomacy cannot operate. As you were mentioning, on the beginning, I am a Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellow, and my project called HEIDI, Higher Education Informal Diplomacy, shows that indeed universities are becoming, these sort of strategic sites of cross-border order diplomacy, no? So, a sort of operational diplomacy that is not metaphorical, but is concrete. You were mentioning alliances, and universities through these European alliances, which are, these networks of different universities, they not only build networks, but they also engage in joint knowledge production. For example, I did this survey, to 52 alliances, and I will come back to the survey over the course of this podcast. But to start, in relation to your question, for example, let's take internationalization that always has been, this big mantra for universities. Well, internationalization is not just about mobility or visibility. In the survey, internationalization emerges as a structured long-term commitment of universities that want, to build partnership, sharing knowledge, sustaining collaboration, and so on. On the one hand, of course, criticism and counter-arguments can be that, the risk for universities is politicization, no? However, yes, politicization is a sort of real vulnerability, but I think the real risk here is institutional vacuum. No? What do I mean? I mean that without formal recognition and supportive policy framework, this form of diplomacy can remain vulnerable to instrumentalization, even if it is a critical component of European foreign policy in practice. So I hope this, gives somehow an idea theoretically of what do we mean.
Absolutely. And Marina, we have a conflict in Ukraine at the moment. So can we say a few things about how this informal diplomacy is different when there is a conflict? So when we take a case of Ukraine as a conflict in Europe or next to European Union, how do universities function as diplomatic actors during this conflict time? Because when there is no conflict, I think it's much more easier because the situation is in peace, and in peace many things are done differently. But when there is a conflict, and we know the cases of the scholars who had to go abroad, some scholars had to go to join the army, and there are many interesting cases. And I think this might give us some perspective of this diplomacy.
Yeah. First of all, you're absolutely right, because the war in Ukraine has really caused severe damage also to the entire educational system. As you were mentioning, there have been losses among students, teachers, administrative staff. Official data say that around more than 4,000, education institutions have been damaged, 400 completely destroyed, and the war has affected around, 1.5 million of young Ukrainians. And many universities indeed have served as shelters and humanitarian hubs. Around, 40 universities have, had to relocate. So in all these, circumstances, universities in Ukraine have acted as, de facto diplomatic infrastructures. They have kept engagement alive when, formal and state-led diplomacy was absent, fragile, or, politically constrained. And I think, it's important to say that in the first phase, European support, here focused on survival, okay? For example, individual support through scholarships, study placement, traineeship, and so on. We also had a lot of emergency projects under Erasmus Plus, or Horizon Europe, Marie Curie Actions, organizations like the French Institute, the British Council, the World Bank. At the same time, structural and institutional aid was also, put into place, including, capacity building, equipment for relocated universities. Around, I think, 5 million euros were invested in the digital higher education ecosystem. What is interesting is that over time, this moved from emergency response towards, more stable and sustainable transformation and integration. Today, more than 40 universities in Ukraine have joined European university alliances. We had around, 100 capacity building projects, 300 European studies project launched and so on. Many alliances, played a big role in this. Research, for example, is focused on digitalization, migration, resilience. That was Uniwell that did a lot. UNITA, which is another alliance, worked a lot with rural education, pushing universities toward the curriculum and calendar harmonizations and so on. Other alliances like Civica, Epicure has formalized their ties with memoranda of understanding. So they gave Ukrainian institutions access to Horizon Europe and Erasmus Plus. So basically, all these, initiatives of the alliances, again, Civica, Universale, C2U, Fortem, Unità, have become a concrete model of informal diplomacy. Why? Because, they have kept Ukrainian higher education running through exchanges, joint programs, policy collaboration. They also integrated Ukrainian scholars into European academic networks. What is interesting is that also in my research, I did some interviews, to vice chancellors and executive director, let me quote, some of these interviews. For example, one vice chancellor, told me that, not talking about their role in Ukraine war, they said, we decided that we will do it anyway by creating just informal strategic partnerships. And he says, this was just a few days after the start of the war. And we were already showing that we considered them as Europeans, together with us, same family. Another one said, we were very vocal. This is a dean for internationalization, saying our rector made clear that we are very pro-European. We created a page on the Alliance website to provide help to Ukrainian partners. We joined hands in a common reaction. Another one said, most of the universities of our alliance were providing a national language program, to help displaced Ukrainians find jobs or schooling for their children. So why this matters? It matters because, these were not symbolic gestures, but this was really, soft power in action. So in practice, even before the European Union was deciding for a coordinated actions, universities, were already in. So they were already becoming these, diplomatic bridges, ensuring, Ukraine full academic participation in Europe, even in the middle of the war. So I think, this gives the idea of the role of universities before, formal intervention of the EU took place at the time.
Marina, some people might say that on one hand, we are arguing with university autonomy, independence, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And on the other hand, there is the foreign policy soft power. So how those limitations, how can we see the tensions between the university autonomy and the foreign policy? Is it overlapping, or how can we define even autonomy in this case? As some people might argue, well, you're basically using universities as a foreign policy extension. How is it?
No, I agree. First of all, let me say that this is one of the most complex, and revealing also tension that emerged from the Heidi research, so from my own research. And you're right, because on paper, universities are institutions which are dedicated to knowledge production, critical inquiry, public service. But in practice, then de facto, this external engagement increasingly intersect with European foreign policy objectives, whether it is, a value-based partnership, for example, in the European neighborhood, or capacity building initiatives in the global south. And from the interviews, and from the data of my research, what we see is that the universities don't simply align or resist, but they negotiate, this tension through three main mechanisms. First, we can say through strategic framing. So universities reframe their international actions, things like, mobility schemes, research consortia, support for scholars at risk, as both expressions of academic solidarity and contributions to European values like democracy, rule of law, multilateralism, and this, dual framing allows them to maintain academic legitimacy while still operating in a geopolitically sensitive context. The second mechanism is, buffering through alliances. We can say that alliances act as collective buffers. They allow universities to act together, amplify their voice, distributing risks, especially in conflict zones or politically contested regions. So in this way, alliances become sort of semi-autonomous actors, making alignment with European priorities less about, direct compliance and more about coordinating positioning. Think about the declarations that many universities have done on academic freedom, support to Ukraine, support to Serbia, with the student protests and so on. And the third mechanism, finally, is negotiated autonomy. So autonomy is not static, is negotiated constantly through European funding frameworks, regulatory requirements, policy agendas. And here universities, what they do, they use their scientific authority and normative capital, not to push back when needed, exactly, to defend academic freedom or to resist instrumentalization in politically motivated partnership, but they also use alignment, strategically to access resources, influence policy, expand the global reach. In many ways, this attention is not a threat, it's a space of diplomacy in itself, Imagine university operating as a sort of boundary actors, translating between this logic of knowledge, and the logic of policy. For example, again, in the Hierarchies survey, the data show that European bodies like the Commission, the Council of Europe are the most frequent partners, cited by around 80% of universities. Embassies and consulates follow closely at 78%, and also political representatives within an institution countries at 77%. And beyond, this world of the state channels, we have NGOs, civil society organizations, think tanks, which are, significant collaborators alongside UN agencies and international humanitarian organizations. So what comes through clearly, I think, also in the interview, is that this informal diplomacy is daily practice. One executive director of an alliance told me, we talk to embassies, NGOs, and UN actors regularly. Informal diplomacy is embedded in our daily institutional practice. And for example, a vice chancellor, told me, well, we don't replace state diplomacy, of course, but we extend and complement it through sustained relationships and mutual trust. So what does this tell us? These patterns show clearly how universities embed themselves in this wider ecosystem of international diplomacy, acting as a sort of connective tissue between state actors, multilateral organizations, and civil society, while maintaining, what is the core of their mission, their academic and institutional autonomy. So I think, to conclude that here the real challenge is making sure that in doing this, they don't lose their core mission, but also that the EU foreign policy frameworks respect and protect, this mission rather than co-opting it.
How does the situation change when there is authoritarian government, when there is some contested legitimacy, or you have some countries that are not welcoming such initiatives that much, but still you can't ignore them? For instance, we can't ignore Russia, we can't ignore Iran, we can't ignore Turkey or other countries, because then we would be isolated ourselves in the European Union. But still, we must keep a dialogue, even though the situation is not as good as it should be. There is a war, there is the strong regime, there are maybe some strong restrictions. And how do these how do these limitations face or shape that informal diplomacy based on your research?
Well, you're absolutely right, because, universities, face indeed, serious structural and political constraints when they operate, in the context you just mentioned. Well, first of all, we have bureaucratic and legal barriers, right? When universities try to support scholars at risk or partner with institutions in conflict zones, they run into rigid visa policies, complex immigration procedures, inconsistent recognition of qualification. So all these, technical hurdles slow down or block the very responsiveness that makes, informal diplomacy effective. Second, as you also mentioned, political pressures and geopolitical tensions make academic collaboration pretty risky. Scholars from countries like Syria, you mentioned Iran, Turkey, Egypt, may face also suspicion, or surveillance at home and abroad. In some cases, collaborating with foreign institutions leads to punishment, undermining academic freedom. So this forces universities to operate in narrow diplomatic spaces where, these boundaries of neutrality are, let's say, constantly negotiated and sometimes penalized. Researchers from, Sudan, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, according to research, they all describe limited resources, brain drain, blocked fieldwork, chronic obstacles to data collection, and so on. And third, there is an issue, and you are, expert in this, studying IR of sanctions and securitization logics, that can sharply limit the scope of partnerships. So university collaborations in this case may be trapped in wider foreign policy agendas. For example, think about European sanctions that can block joint research or exchange agreements with institutions in a regime that are considered illegitimate or, at best hostile. So in such settings, universities risk, this was what I said on the beginning, the risk is being instrumentalized by foreign policy or marginalized by it. And also, there is a major institutional gap because, a clear framework exists to help universities, to tackle these political tensions. But without a stable long-term funding and protective legal mechanism, because we might agree on the general principle, but then every diplomatic actor knows that the issue is the technicalities. So without this legal mechanism, universities are obliged to use ad hoc resources like temporary grants, which then are insufficient. And finally, academic freedom itself becomes fragile, right? Because universities cannot act as credible diplomatic agents if the autonomy is compromised. So, protecting academic freedom and institutional independence is essential for any diplomatic role. Think about Palestine, right? The case of Palestinian higher education illustrates this risk. There has been a dramatic escalation in the Israeli official and public rhetoric, describing, Palestinian universities as centers for producing terrorism. In Gaza, people talk about edukicide. 11 out of 19 higher education institutions have been destroyed, leaving, a vacuum in local higher education. However, there are some promising measures. For example, the University of Oslo has participated in projects, including, in Gaza through the NORDED-supported EPAL initiative. They have helped the Palestinian institutions to develop digital and hybrid education programs in autonomous areas. So in sum, universities, carry in conflict areas this enormous diplomatic potential, but in this, context, this potential is constrained by bureaucracy, political interference, and legal fragility, and also uneven protection. So, unless, these limitations are addressed, the role of universities as informal diplomatic actors will remain powerful but precarious.
I want to ask you about your opinion on Africa. because I have some good close scholars that I am communicating with from Africa, from different African countries.
Yeah.
And there are many good cases of collaboration between Africa and European Union universities. And when we had a discussion, some of them, they mentioned what Mandela said, that education is the strongest weapon in some way. How do you see the support of Africa from the European Union perspective in the recent years? And do you think that we should do more for Africa as a continent?
For Africa, actually, as you know, there is the initiative of the Global Gateway of the European Union. Africa is now a strategic component of European foreign policy. More recently, I think there has been developed a new DG, DG MENA for the relationships with, North Africa and Middle East and the Gulf. So, there is a lot going on. European alliances actually are actively involved in Africa. There are many projects, for example, with South Africa. There are capstone projects with Senegal. There are projects with Ghana. These projects are not only involving, joint exchange of scholars, so mobility of students and staff, like the classic, exchange, but real, concrete projects in terms of, curricula, in terms of, languages, in terms of policy fields, for example, in the field of maritime industry. The problem with Africa, and, we can mention later about this, is, as you know, also at the time of Mandela, is distribution of unequal resources, right? So there are also issues of language barriers, there are issues of visas, of unsynchronized academic calendars. But to be honest, many European alliances are currently involved in projects with Africa. There has been an event last September in Toulouse that was about the internationalization of the European University Initiative, and there were, many academics, from Africa talking about the partnerships that they have with European alliances. Of course, they are associate partners, but things, I think are quite, promising, although exactly the issue of unequal distribution of resources, and also the issue that, we can talk maybe at the end about that, of, this post-colonialism, sort of practice is also, something, to consider.
Marina, there is one critical issue that we should comment on, and that's the situation where you have a project and the institution abroad, they like the project because usually there is money coming with project or there are some benefits. On the other hand, those institutions might argue that the European Union is exporting norms, for instance, human rights, sustainability, questions around climate change. How we should approach this situation when you have a good project, it comes with funding, but also it comes with norms. What would be the approach of the European Union when there is such a question on the table? And how do you recommend to other institutions from outside of the European Union to react when there is such a discussion or debate? Because I come across this quite often when speaking with scholars, especially from countries like Africa, Asia, Middle East, where there is a strong either religion background, so they want to keep that background, or there is some social norms they don't want to change.
Well, actually, this is exactly what I mentioned on the beginning, this difference between, science diplomacy led by state interest or knowledge diplomacy, which is very much a top-down hierarchical. I think, when we talk about the role of universities in EU diplomacy, in terms of, informal diplomatic role, it is less about, exporting values and more about diffusing them through long-term relationships, collaboration, and trust. And I think that, European university alliances make a difference in this. They really sit at the heart of this process. They carry European values like academic freedom, democracy, sustainability, multilateral cooperation, but these values are not projected, from the top down. They are embedded in mobility schemes, in joint degrees, and co-created research initiatives. Here co-creation is the key word. Think about, we were talking about Ukraine, think about, Civica, what did. Civica is one of the alliance with Ukrainian universities, because what began, in Ukraine at the time as an emergency response evolved into a collaboration, a co-creation on topics like digitalization, migration, resilience, positioning Ukraine not as passive recipient, but as an active contributor, reinforcing inclusion, democratic alignment, institutional resilience, or Utopia, which is another alliance, that did this initiative on Young Leaders Academy, showing how alliances link leadership training to core European values like engagement and democratic participation. We were talking about Africa before, and we see, the same pattern in Africa-Europe partnerships, where co-creation and equity are central. For example, alliances like Europa, Aurora, Charm-EU acknowledge, the historical imbalances, that you were mentioning. And they work toward a more equal partnerships. And here, for example, sustainability, mutual capacity building, trust, again, are built into this project design. For example, UNAVEX did this initiative like the digital enhanced mobility, connecting in Africa, students and researchers across borders, diffusing values like, civic engagement, inclusivity, knowledge, and so on. And in my survey, for example, in my research, sustainable development is not peripheral, is a core axis of informal academic diplomacy. And more than 60% of alliances, focus on sustainable development goals linked to domains like quality education, sustainable cities, gender equity. But it's true that, there are limits. You were talking about projects. Well, funding is a short term. Bureaucracy, again, is fragmented. Resource inequalities slow down implementation. So, alliances, for example, they would like to do more on sustainable development goals diplomatically, but, they need long-term and mission-driven support. So, in this case, I think that, sustainable development goals are the common ground in this, fractured geopolitics, especially, building credibility in the global south. So the evidence is there. The problem again is with these, policy frameworks that still need, to catch up.
Let's speak a little bit about technical steps, because we were speaking about informal diplomacy on a theoretical level. We mentioned projects, conflicts, we mentioned Africa and other related issues. But people might ask, so what does it mean to have or to conduct that diplomacy? And therefore, let's speak a little bit about specific European programs. For instance, Erasmus+, Horizon Europe, and other programs. What is the objective of the whole package of those programs? Yeah. And because we might have viewers from outside of the European Union, maybe we should explain practically, like Erasmus+. What is it? Why is it? What does Horizon Europe mean?
Yeah. Thank you. So first of all, these are all funding projects of the European Union. They are complementary in the sense that, they all respond to the same goal of creating a European higher education area. Through mobility, research projects, a joint initiative. Erasmus actually is the oldest program of the European Union. It was created in 1986. And at the beginning, Erasmus had this sort of, soft power component because it was based on, exchange of students across another European country. So, for example, a student from the University of Rome in Italy could have spent a period of study, so attending another university in another European country. So this is how Erasmus started, an exchange of students. Over the course of the decades, of course, Erasmus has changed, and now it's called Erasmus Plus, right? So Erasmus, encompasses a series of initiatives which are not only mobility of staff and students, but are also research projects, a capacity building initiative. Erasmus has also expanded, its horizon. In the beginning, Erasmus was, very much confined to the European Union. And now Erasmus, we also have Erasmus Mundus, for example, so gives the opportunity to students, scholars living in other parts of the world, to come to Europe for a period of study and vice versa. Horizon is complementary to Erasmus in the sense that Horizon is based on a consortium of universities, right, that join together to propose a joint project. These projects usually, are always based, of course, on the priority of the European Commission. So, whereas, we can say that Erasmus is more operational, right, is more on the ground, Horizon is more research based. Is more research based and is based on projects that have an impact. Erasmus Plus is also a big umbrella, right? Under Erasmus Plus, you have different actions. For example, I am Marie Skłodowska-Curie. The Marie Skłodowska-Curie projects are part of the Erasmus Plus project. The Marie Curie, for example, is a grant, a very competitive grant given by the European Union to undertake a research project in another European country. But the Marie Curie is also the Marie Curie Global. The global means giving a European citizen or a non-European citizen the opportunity to undertake a research project either Europe or elsewhere. So these are more or less is the description, for non-EU specialists of these programs. So they all refer to the area of education and higher education. Now, linking, these programs to the topic of diplomacy, these programs have now a big responsibility, as there are at the moment, discussions for the next budget of, Erasmus, Horizon, and so on. And of course, strengthening academic diplomacy will depend on how, Erasmus, Horizon Europe, and other European research programs evolve. The question is not really about budget, right? But it is about whether these programs can deliver coherent and long-term diplomatic impact. For example, Erasmus Plus is entering now is next phase, from 26 to 28, with a focus on deepening and continuity. For universities, this is more, as I was saying before, than mobility. It's an opportunity to embed long-term partnerships and use academic cooperation as a form of soft but durable diplomacy. There are also the funding of the European Research Council. As you know, it's facing a very sensitive moment because the Commission now wants that the ERC comply with the corporate policies, a sort of undefined phase that some people argue might reduce the authority of the President and the Scientific Council. The Marie Skłodowska-Curie Actions, they remain always bottom-up, but a new clause allows the Commission to target specific themes, regions, or strategic autonomy goals. So again, for the Marie Curie to remain credible as a diplomatic tool, it must stay focused on long-term European research interests, not short-term political reactions. Horizon Europe now is moving, into the new FP10, so the Framework Program 10 from 2028, with a doubling of the research and innovation budget. Also, the ERC and Marie Curie funding, is expected to double. Also, I think the European Innovation Council and SME programs would nearly triple again. So, there is a lot going on. And I think, perhaps most significant for diplomacy and also, the countries you were mentioning before, collaboration with third countries will continue. But now, the European Union can formally exclude non-European education area partners from sensitive areas. And, this is a rule that creates both opportunities and risk. But I think that, this evolution reflects a wider reality, that science, technology, innovation, education are now central to international relations. In 2025, the Commission launched this European Science Diplomacy Framework, which is very important because it recognizes that Europe must leverage its research ecosystem, address global challenges like the Sustainable Development Goals, and tackle, this increasingly competitive but fragmented landscape. And this is exactly, where universities are essential, bigger budgets and stronger frameworks only matter again, if they protect excellence and autonomy while connecting, research and mobility into this coherent platform for informal diplomacy. So yes, we need a reform, of course, of all these programs, but again, we don't need to politicize them. We need a reform that create coherence, align mobility and research with external engagement, and protect, this academic integrity that I think, makes Europe's diplomacy credible in the end.
When we mention the EU policies, we know that when we want to reform them, it's usually a very long and complicated process because of the voting system and the frameworks and everything like that. Is the same situation with the universities, with the educational reforms that you mentioned? And are people willing to reform, or people like the conservative way of keeping how it is at the moment?
Well, I will not spend much on this question because it's a very sensitive topic, Martin. I mean, as you know, education is not a common area. Has never been a common area like, competition policy, trade, and so on. Although, it is very significant, the level of coordination and, let's say, Europeanization that the Commission has in this policy field. I actually wrote a book called, Constructing the Europe of Knowledge, the Transformations of Education from the mid-70s until 2010, because, in the beginning, education, as I said, not only was not a common policy, but has always been a super, super sensitive policy area. Member states have always been, super jealous of their prerogative because education, falls within the identity of the nation state. So what does it mean? It means that it's very difficult, to do reform in education policy without, member states' consent. Amazing steps, I think, have been, undertaken. If you think about not only the Bologna process, but, leave Bologna because it's mainly intergovernmental. But if you think, the European University Initiative, how, in the time frame of a couple of years, we now have 65 alliances, including more than 570 universities, pulling together resources and so on. This also gives, the extent of the coordination the Commission has achieved. There are, of course, obstacles, and there will remain obstacles to reform. Why there are obstacles? Because, first of all, it's not a common policy, and second, many issues related to education falls also within the remit of labor market policies, right? Recognition of qualification, wages, salaries, and so on. So at the moment, for example, one of the flagship initiatives of the Commission is this European degree, but there are, of course, a lot of obstacles that needs to be sorted. For sure, it seems there is a common willingness and also common enthusiasm, from member states to do more, to not harmonize education policies because, you don't tell harmonization is a very bad word and it triggers immediately, defense and resistance, but there are many promising steps, to a further coordination of these policies. But, to conclude, let's not forget that education policy is still ruled by the Treaty of Maastricht of 1992. So the role of the Commission is support and supplement member state action. That's it. And it's still this. So we will need a treaty reform to do more.
Yeah, the environment and the policies that are always complicated, but I think with the clever ideas and good research we can navigate through. And I think it's important for the European Union not to get sort of like relaxing time, but to be active in this area, because we have many geopolitical shifts, we have many internal European Union problems that are impacting everything. The next question, Marina, when you have the university and we speak about diplomacy, who is acting within this diplomacy? For instance, who is the most important? Is it the chancellor? Is it the rector? Is it the boss of the department? Or was the role of the students going for Erasmus to also be active in this diplomacy? How would you describe this hierarchy?
Well, again, it depends, Martin, because, universities are institutions, and like every institutions are complex and multi-layered. So, you do have a macro level, then you have a meso level, and then you have your micro level with, students and academic staff. It's also important, of course, and this, came also through the course of my interviews, the most important diplomatic actors are those who are at the lead of the university. So you have vice chancellors, you have dean for internationalizations, you have dean for global engagement. When it comes to alliances, the real diplomatic actors are the executive directors, because they are in this sort of precarious and very delicate role, to manage the expectations of different universities that also have, different status sometimes, So not only elite universities, but also, universities who are a bit more teaching oriented, for example, rather than, research intensive. So I will say that, yes, in terms of decision making, the real diplomatic actors are those who are leading the university. Again, the chancellor, the dean, and so on. But students, when it comes to the operational level, right, of this informal diplomacy, of course, you have the coordinators of the alliances, you have the academic staff, and you have students who are the biggest ambassadors. I mean, the role of students has always been considered strategic and important. Think about the role of alumni that in many geographical realities are considered, a true soft power instrument. Perhaps, less developed in continental Europe, but if you think about, the US, UK, Australia, alumni are part and parcel of, university strategies. So I think your question, has different levels of answers. If we are looking at the decision-making level, or we are looking at the operational level, because then, think a student. We were talking about Erasmus before, or who is doing a visiting period, in another university from a completely different culture. He goes there, he brings not only his knowledge, but he brings, his culture, his way of thinking, of living, and he comes back, completely enriched in this. So if we distinguish the different levels, I will say that, from the bottom up, students, coordinators, academic staff, top down, of course, more the elites and senior management of the university.
Let's touch geopolitics a little bit, and there is a question: how should EU academia recalibrate its diplomatic strategies when we have those geopolitical shifts like the US-China competition, or we have the post-colonial critics, or even we have a new leader like Donald Trump, who is influencing basically everything?
Yeah. Well, yes, absolutely. First of all, recalibrating this EU academic diplomacy means adapting, to a world, as you say, to geopolitical polycrisis and permacrisis, and post-colonial demands for equity as well. Here, I think I see mainly 6 key moves. First, reframe attraction as a strategic reciprocity. The US-China technology race has turned this, talent mobility into blunt competition. And I think Europe here needs to present itself not as a destination, but as a co-design space. And this means, co-branded research calls with regions like Latin America, Indo-Pacific, and so on. Recently, we had the launch of the campaign like Choose Europe, Choose a Science, And this ERC relocation uplift show that this shift is already underway. Second, we were talking about Horizon. Here the use of Horizon widening actions as a diplomatic test bed. Peripheral, research ecosystems cannot remain, subcontractors, as, sometimes they are. Again, expanding programs like twinning, European research area chairs, into mini consortia with new low or middle income partners could surely build this credibility for European diplomacy. Third, the role of open science, for example, as US-China decoupling threatens, standards in AI or quantum, Europe can lead by insisting you-funded platforms publish, code and multilingual data, unless ethic-based risk board rules otherwise. Also, I think, it will be important to institutionalize, you're studying IR, institutionalize this, track 2+ diplomacy, University alliances already mediate informally, as we've seen in conflict zone. So here, for example, a European University Rapid Response Facility, within the European External Action Service for heritage protection, emergency digital learning, ceasefire monitoring, will give the EU a standing law politics diplomatic tool. Then, we mentioned this before, decolonize partnerships, Erasmus Mundus programs, with former colonies, should have, this joint governance, co-awarded degrees, so sort of, let's say, shifting Erasmus from an export model to a genuine co-creation, again, easing political pushback and reinforcing equity. And then I think linking science diplomacy to economic security in a way which is more transparent. For example, at EU level, we have the Joint Research Center. One idea could be to create an academic security observatory, hosted by GRC, allowing university to check risk openly, keep dialogue alive with US and Chinese scholars, and so on. So recalibration, I think, doesn't really mean mimicking Washington, Beijing, zero-sum logics, but it means leveraging Europe's comparative advantage, openness, multilateral rule-making, its widening instruments to really turn, universities into the 21st diplomatic infrastructures, that speak to excellence and equity in a fractured world. So I think, academia is not just a symbol of European soft power. It's really its engine. And European universities really operate already as, diplomatic infrastructures and sustaining, trust and cooperation. So, the EU must really protect, this academic freedom. Again, align programs as Erasmus Plus, Horizon, ensuring that, this diplomacy is not only the privilege of a few elite institutions. And the last thing I would like to mention that, this is already, I think, ongoing within the European Union. In November 2024, it was published the Draghi report. If we read the Draghi report, the role of universities and also alliances, has a big role in, restoring Europe growth and competitiveness. So let's hope that, academia will really become, this EU most credible form of soft power, but a soft power that speaks, this global language of knowledge, co-creation, and trust, exactly, at a moment in which the world needs it most.
Maybe we can ask, is the EU's diplomatic deployment of universities inclusive, or does it privilege elite institutions? Because I think this is very important for people coming to the European Union. Where are they going to be placed? At what sort of institutions?
Yeah, okay. Well, I would like to say that, somehow it is framed as inclusive, it's officially framed as inclusive. The reality then is a bit always different, is that structural asymmetries, persist, they privilege, as you say, better resourced institutions. So this, in the end reinforces intra-European hierarchies. Uh, However, the survey I did reflect a sort of optimism, right? 95% of respondents there said that alliances offer joint rights, shared resources, and political legitimacy. The implementation data tell a different story. For example, financial and operational asymmetries remain critical bottlenecks. Only 40% of respondents of the survey, and we are talking about almost 300 respondents, so 298, 43% agree that there are adequate financial and human resources to implement their alliances. One third, around 30%, report that some partners are more dominant, and around 40% explicitly note unequal presence across organizations. Funding as well, is a bit uneven. Only 70% of partnerships leverage diverse funding sources, leaving, many dependent then on centralized or uneven streams. And this is a pattern that then benefits, institutions that have a stronger grant infrastructure, take, the grant office of a university, not many of them have. However, it's important that, in the case of alliance, the membership to alliances boost reputation. 90% of respondents agree that being in an alliance raises their institution national and international status. But again, reputational benefits are unevenly distributed. Research credibility, for example, and institutional transparency show lower agreement levels. And, of course, elite universities have more, robust internal systems and visibility, smaller partners sometimes can be in the shadows. So what does it mean? It means that, these dynamics, why they are important? Because they carry diplomatic functions and implication, universities that have greater visibility and capacity dominate engagements with the third countries. Alliances, may claim co-creation and trust-based diplomacy, but then the ability to host delegations, coordinate responses, sustain long-term projects, remains concentrated in elite nodes. Also, linguistic barriers, again, misaligned academic calendars and resource disparities can all limit the scope of these partnerships. And of course, not every university, Martin, has the same capacity, to engage internationally. Some institutions have stronger global networks, others are still building them. We were talking before about Horizon and Erasmus, well, even in these alliance themselves assume a baseline capacity, things like English medium instruction, legal expertise, digital infrastructures, not all institutions can meet these. So what does it mean? That this produces, de facto a sort of two-tier system where core universities shape the agenda and others follow. So basically, while the EU has created a formal inclusive platform for academic diplomacy, this operational, terrain is a bit uneven. So addressing, this, I think, requires inclusivity. So which means, support for under-resourced institutions, recognitions of this, form of excellence beyond global rankings. We need other kind of performance indicators and long-term capacity building, especially, for the small ones or universities in Eastern and Southern Europe. So to make it short, this current model of academic diplomacy has a huge transformative potential, but it risks, without this safeguard to reinforce this internal asymmetry and undermining, this pluralism it claims, to promote.
From my perspective, what I would recommend to European universities as a one little thing, one little detail to help other students or candidates from abroad is to better explain why sometimes there are calls for particular regions, or there is the call for women, or there is the call for candidates, let's say under 40, under 35, because some students understand this like European Union is talking about inclusivity, but then the call is for particular category of people. And sometimes there is no explanation. It's just simple written. And then people are wondering, why is it that, when the European Union is speaking about inclusivity? So that would be one little point that I would recommend when universities are writing and proposing those little grants or projects to better clarify why is it written like that and what's the objective. The last question for today's interview. I know how you are researching this topic, how deeply you go to the details, to question people, and to analyzing the data. What would you recommend for people who are interested in the same research topic? What would be a good research categories, maybe some subtopics of this field to research, and where do you see some research gaps that should be addressed based on your career, based on your career as a consultant, as a researcher, as an academic?
Well, I mean, I could talk forever about that.
Yeah, we have basically 5 minutes, so let's be concise.
Well, I mean, first of all, Martin, the role of universities as informal academic actors is a pretty new research area. Is still very much controversial at the theoretical level because, much often I'm always asked, oh, okay, but how does this differ, from science diplomacy or, knowledge diplomacy? So the first thing will be engage, theoretically with this distinction. And the way I do and the way I would advise to do is, to start as I'm doing, start with the data, let the data speak. So, taking exactly, doing, surveys, doing, elite interviews, doing, participant observations. In my case, one thing I would like to do, and one thing, I think we now need, more and more data on this to understand the role not only of European alliances, but the role of other alliances. The European University Alliance is one among the many. You have others, you have the Coimbra Group, you have Leroux, you have, the Santander Group, you have Unica, you have alliances, organizations in Asia, in the UK, in Africa, in Latin America. So I think it will be very interesting also to do a comparative study and see how other alliances, again, in Latin America or in Asia are working as, actors of informal diplomacy. At the same time, to focus on specific, exactly, subtopics, as you were mentioning. For example, something we really don't know nothing is the role of students, I mean, how really students are acting as informal diplomatic actors, what is their role, as ambassadors of, informal diplomacy, but, in their concrete exchanges and mobility projects. The same on academic staff. We don't know much. I think there is some research on the role of project managers. So the role, I don't know, the project managers of the Horizon projects, but not really the role of the PIs, the principal investigators. So how do they really act as actors of informal diplomacy? One thing again that, I could tackle in my interviews, but, what I'm doing mainly is a mapping of all these, huge terrain. The role of universities in conflict areas. Again, exactly, Ukraine is something I am currently studying, but again, what about, Palestine? What about Sudan? What about, many other conflict areas? We know that there has been, this huge network of scholars at risk that, has provided, scholarships to academics, coming from conflict areas. But what has been really the impact of this program, so also it will be very interesting to have studies about the impact of these, at-risk actions, because we don't know. We don't have evaluations exposed about this. So again, this is, a field of study which, I would really see very much promising. Another thing is, the interaction, taking universities as organizations. How do they interact with other actors? How do they interact with, formal diplomatic actors? How do they interact with other non-state actors? Universities for sure in countries like Africa, the Global South and so on, they do work in closely contact with civil society organizations, NGOs, exactly what do they do? What are the outcomes of this collaboration? We don't know so much about that. I'm sure there will be like some small single case studies, but not only from an academic research point of view. So studying again, this interaction of universities between, the top, between, more formal diplomatic actors, but between, actors on the ground, how do they really contribute all together to this, informal diplomacy? So, these are among the aspects. And finally, about the European Union, exactly, how do these universities, how these European universities, you made a questions about that before, how these European universities export, European norms and values. Because again, this is something I've been tackling in my research, in which I'm covering, several subtopics. But I think this is something very interesting. Are they ambassadors of European values on behalf of the European Union, or do they, pursue their own values on their own extra-European Union? So more or less, these are, the topics I see developing, in the next 5-10 years in this, a fascinating research agenda. So theoretically, in terms of decision making, in terms of, operational field, in terms of actors and agents and mechanisms.
Marina, many thanks for sharing your insightful thoughts, research outcomes with us. Many thanks for your time for this interview. And based on the last answer, I think you really need some good quality colleagues. So that would be good sort of call for people who are interested in this field of research. And I would like to encourage younger researchers or junior researchers to contact even Marina if you have any questions regarding research. And who knows, maybe there will be good, nice project that will contribute to improve conditions also for the students coming to European Union through those special programs. Marina, many thanks again for being on IR Thinker.
Thank you so much, Martin. And yes, as you know, I want to echo your last call for help. Yes, please do get in touch. And, we can contribute together to shape this agenda on universities as informal diplomatic actors.
Thank you very much.